Welcome everyone. What I'd like to do is start off. I know, some of you may be familiar with this program, some of you may not. So this is a new program that I have launched this year in the school system. And I guess a little bit of background. This program was part of my, past position with the Calgary Police Service. I worked with the Calgary Police Service for, I guess, almost 18 years. And I was heavily involved in the school system. Prior to working with Calgary Police, I was a criminal justice educator with the Calgary John Howard Society. So I did a lot of work in junior and senior high schools, talking about the, transition from way back in the day, the Young Offenders Act to the Youth Criminal Justice Act. So did a lot of work in schools. I feel like I've worked in schools for over 25 years. My role with the police, I was hired to develop a program that addressed the root cause of hate. Way back when, what we were seeing in Calgary is there was a very prominent Aryan Guard presence, and there were some white supremacy rallies and white pride rallies and different things like that. So there was a need, right, to come out and get out to the schools and provide some education. So I had developed a program for the Calgary Police, and I coordinated that for almost 2 decades. And I've made a decision probably in the last year or two to branch out on my own. But I couldn't forget about the program that I hold near and dear to my heart. And so I've decided to relaunch this program in our school system. So the program is DeleteHate. I encourage all of you to be involved, ask questions. I'm not sure what those of you that are watching, I'm not sure if you're educators, what your roles are in the community, but I think it'd be really, really nice to hear from some of you that are watching, just, so I am able to maybe identify any areas that this program could benefit your organization, the community that you work with, the schools that you attend. Without seeing folks, I have no idea the demographic or kind of who's watching. So if there's anything throughout this presentation that you would like to ask or to kind of get some more information around, please feel free. Pop it in the chat or just pop your face up here on the camera and share, ask questions, whatever you're comfortable with. So with that, I'm going to see if I can get the computer to work. If I can, then we're doing great. So what I'd like to do is start off briefly, just kind of going over, some of the goals of this program, what my hopes are, when I deliver this presentation. This morning, I was at a high school here in Calgary, and I'm going to be working at that high school all week. What a lot of schools are doing is they're really trying to have this information delivered to the whole student body. But one thing that I really am conscious of is when we are talking about, topics as sensitive as hate and discrimination, racism, homophobia. For me, I think it's important that I'm able to not only control my audience, but to really engage the students and the learners in terms of maybe what they're seeing happening, ways that they can improve some of the things that are happening in their schools. So with that, what I tend to do is facilitate to smaller group sizes. So that could look like class sizes. This week, for example, we have a theater at one of the high schools, and we're bringing in group sizes of approximately 80 to 100. So it really depends on the need of the school. But I think, I guess best case scenario was having those classroom settings where I can facilitate, some exercises, really, get in and do some scenario work with the students, because I think for most of us, we would agree that, scenario-based learning, hands-on learning, having, being engaged, I think that really aids in our learning. So that's really what I try to push for with this program. But the age demographic that I'm marketing to is junior and senior high schools, specifically for this presentation. I also have presentations for elementary students around building empathy, healthy relationships, the bully and the bystander. But DeleteHate would start grades 7 and up. So it could be all the way up to any age group. I think there's a lot of need in the community to learn more about hate and its implications, some of the legal ramifications, sections in the criminal code, the importance of reporting, and why there's such a lack of reporting, which we will address throughout this presentation. But for the school presentation, I guess my ultimate goals, one is to raise awareness, right? To raise awareness around issues of diversity, inclusion. I talk about, we discuss terms like bias and assumptions. On, I think it was Saturday, I facilitated a workshop here for the Ignite Change conference around bias and assumptions. So that's tends to be a topic of interest among many groups these days, and rightly so. I think it's an important topic for all of us to discuss. But yeah, so the awareness at that school level to talk about what's diversity, what's inclusion, what's bias, what's assumption. One issue for me, and one feeling that I had, is that we can't just blanket term everything bullying, and that was a big, one of the big reasons for me to develop a program like this. I think, it's one thing to talk about bullying at an elementary level, elementary age, school age. But once, our youth get into junior high, senior high school, when we're in the workplace, I think that we really need to be accountable for our language. And I think by just calling things bullying, it doesn't really get down to really what that root cause is and the impact. If it's a racial slur, then let's start calling things, for what they are and holding people accountable for the language. So if it's racism, it's racism. If it's hate, it's hate. If it's homophobia. So really getting out and, providing some awareness around even just the terminology and the impact of our language. So that's one of the goals I have, just really that awareness piece. It's amazing to see how little our youth know, even around like the legal age of, that individuals can be held legally responsible. A lot of our youth still have that, mindset or that belief that, I have to be 18, for the police to charge me, or I have to be, 14, 16. A lot of times they're not even aware of the legal age, right? That they can be held criminally responsible for their actions. So I think awareness is huge in this area. Also preventing and reducing, right? I think, we'll talk a little later about hate incidents. So it's the words, the name calling, some of the things that we're hearing and we're seeing. And for me, my hope is that through education, through awareness, through getting out and really providing some skills and tools for our students to use, is that we can prevent and or reduce the amount of hate incidents and ultimately hate crimes, right? For those of you that are familiar with the Alberta Hate Crimes Committee and the work that we do, with the members sitting around the table, I think it's that's really what we want to do. We want to provide that education, provide that awareness. And for me, I really hope that through these presentations, through a program like this, that we can see a reduction in the amount of hate incidents and hate crimes. And thirdly, it's to empower, right? It's to empower our students, to empower the teachers. It's to empower every single person that, that I'm able to deliver presentations to speak up, right? And to say something when we witness forms of discrimination and hate. Now, that being said, number one is safety, right? Like, I'm not encouraging anyone to be the superhero out in the schools or in the communities and, interfering or, jumping into something that could potentially put them in an unsafe situation. But how do we empower ourselves and empower one another to have some of those conversations with maybe even our close friends, our loved ones, people on our sports teams, and to stand up, right, against certain things that we hear. So we'll talk about that as well a little later throughout this presentation, which is also why I encourage some of you to put on your cameras, because I think this is a topic that it's so rich in conversation. And so I just can't say that enough. I know some people just don't like to be on camera, but I think there's only 8 people watching, so why not? So if you can jump on there, do it. Usually what I will do is I'll start off, a conversation with any of my groups, and I'll ask folks, what makes us diverse? What does diversity mean to you? And if I was to ask those of you that are watching, if you want to put something in the chat, what makes us diverse? When you hear that word, what comes to mind? The students were way more chatty than the people watching this presentation today. But what makes us diverse? Is anyone able to put anything in the chat or pop on and have a conversation? Oh, I see one more. I see 9, 8, 9. People teeter. They come in, they come out. Right. So when you think of diversity, things that, come to mind and, certain things that folks usually say, people bring up race, religion. Thank you, Ivana. Different ages, races, backgrounds, right? Some folks will say economic status, varying abilities, right? Gender, all the things that make us different, right? And if I was standing in front of all of you and, we were all staring at one another, I would ask you to raise your hands and I would ask how many of you celebrate diversity? How many of you think diversity is a good thing? And I would kind of gauge my audience and I would find out, hopefully the majority of us, we have our hands up. We see the value of diversity. We see how important it is and how rich it makes every single one of our communities, But then I'll, ask the question, do you think everybody likes diversity? All right. Do you think everybody celebrates diversity the same way that, some of us do? Some of us who consider ourselves to be allies and do the work in, DEI and, anti-hate training and things like that. Do you think there's some people out there that kind of resist diversity? And why? Why do you think there's that resistance that we see in some organizations, community groups, peer circles, sports teams? Like, what do you think that's about? Why do you think some folks wouldn't necessarily want to celebrate diversity? Ivana seems to be the only one that wants to share any answers. For anyone else online, what do you think? What might be some barriers or some issues for folks that don't necessarily celebrate diversity, or maybe they don't feel that diversity is a good thing? Where do you think that's coming from? Often what we'll hear is, some people are afraid, they're fearful of what they don't know. There's that lack of education. Sometimes people will say jealousy, or I don't really know what everyone means, by that necessarily. Depends on who says it. But, some folks will say anger, all these words that are obviously coming from somewhere, right? For me, and I celebrate diversity. I think diversity is beautiful, but I'm also fully aware that not everyone does, right? Not everyone thinks it's a good thing for all types of reasons. So I think it's important to think about and important just to maybe have some conversations with those around you, right? To find out, I wonder why some people aren't as accepting of differences, right? And I wonder where that comes from. So I think it's an interesting conversation to have. I think what we're still seeing, especially in our school system today, is that, we're seeing youth, not only youth, this happens in the workplace, let's not kid ourselves. But I think what we're seeing in the school system is that there are people getting picked on, made fun of, being called names, being harassed simply because they're different, right? And so, I'll always start off a presentation as I did this morning. And I said, thanks, Terry, for saying something. I appreciate that. It means a lot, just so you know. And I'll come back to your comment. But what I'll always challenge our students with is I always say, in the beginning, I'll ask our students, how many of you think diversity is a good thing? How many of you love the fact that you have diversity in your schools? And they'll have their hands up, everything's all great. And then I'll say, okay, well then how many of you agree with me that there's a lot of, call it what it is, a lot of stuff going on in your schools, or people are being harassed, picked on simply because they're different? And then a ton of students have their hands up. So I'm like, okay, so what's going on here? How do we deal with that? If we're okay with diversity and we want to celebrate diversity, then why are there still people getting picked on simply because they're different? So I think it's really, really important to talk about. And I'm sure if, if we were all online and have our cameras on and engaging in a conversation, I'm sure, We could all share examples of maybe where we were excluded or maybe not heard or maybe not taken seriously simply because we were different, or maybe we didn't fit that norm, whatever that norm looked like in that particular setting, whether it be in a friend circle, at our workplace, but a comment in the chat box was people who look to blame others for their woes. I mean, it's a lot easier to point the finger at somebody else than to look inward, right? And I think that's a struggle for a lot of people, right? It's a lot easier to blame everything else on maybe something that's happening versus us looking, at our own community, at things that are going on, within our own lives, right? So yeah, thank you very much. Okay, but in terms of diversity, it's all the things that make us different. All right. Another, I think, very important point and a very, important area of this piece of this presentation is it's the respect piece. And I think that's what we see. We see a lot of people almost feeling like their backs are against the wall, or feeling like they're being like forced to think a certain way, or forced to agree with a certain person's lifestyle or an ideology or whatever. But it's not about that. I always tell people it's not about liking one another, agreeing with all of our lifestyles, having a ton in common maybe with every single person we meet. It's not about that, because we're not going to like everyone. Everyone's not going to like us. Maybe our personality and somebody else's personality just doesn't mix well. And there's that. Maybe someone doesn't like the way I dress or I look or my culture, right? We're always going to encounter that in our lives. And for me, it's more about never mind whether we agree or we disagree. How do we get to a place of just mutual respect, regardless of our differences, right? Like, to go to work every single day and just feel respected for our children, for, our friends' children, for the young people in our society today, to be able to go to school every single day and just be treated with respect, right? You think about what that would do for learning, what that would do for mental health, and I think people are underestimating the strength, and the impact that just treating others with respect, like how far that goes. And I think that's where we're lacking, I think sometimes there's some people that think, well, I don't agree with that person, or I don't like that person's belief system. Well, that's okay. But how do we get to a place where we can just treat one another with that mutual respect? And so for me, and all the work that I do and all the work that I will continue to do until I can't talk anymore, it's how do we get to that place, right? That's my ultimate dreamy place to be, to be able to wake up every single morning, go out into my community, go watch my son's soccer games, have him go to school, have me go to work, in friendship circles, and just see people treating one another with respect. I think that would be a really beautiful place for our whole entire world, if we could get there somehow. But there's a lot of things standing in the way, right? Which is kind of what we need to talk about. And feel free to please ask questions, make a comment. Comments always make these presentations so much better for me, especially, right? So I just feel like I'm talking at a screen, and it's not my favorite way of facilitating, but hey, I hope you're all getting something out of it. I have up here, self-awareness is the key to cultural awareness. And, when you read this, I'm not sure what comes to mind. But I think it's really important to be aware and to be comfortable and have some knowledge around our own culture, why we act a certain way, why we behave a certain way, why we believe certain things, right? Self-awareness to even who we are as individuals, as a family unit, in a relationship. I think it's really, really important to think about that, because there's a lot of lack of understanding out there when it comes to other cultures, other religions, other groups, diverse groups. I think there's a lot of misunderstanding and really lack of education, right? Because I think there's a lot of us who just don't even ask questions. We'll talk a little bit later, kind of goes back to my bias and assumption workshop the other day. But I think a lot of us continue to judge one another based on 10% of who we are. And that's kind of that given identity, that visible layer, that a lot of times we get placed in certain boxes, right? And a lot of times we don't even learn, and we don't ask questions. we just kind of stop at that 10% and we don't learn about one another. So I think it's really important to start walking towards some of those biases, to start learning more about ourselves. It wasn't until, oh my gosh, probably I was well into probably even my 30s, really, when I really started like delving more into my culture, right? I come from, my family's on the East Coast. My mom's Italian, my dad's Lebanese. But I never asked questions growing up. I was like, oh, I'm Italian and Lebanese. I like the food. We have traditions. We celebrate holidays. Like, I didn't really ask questions about, my ancestry and where they came from and, different things about my grandparents and even my own parents. I never explored that. And I think what that did is it really prevented me from really learning more about other cultures, right? Because if we don't even care to learn about our own, then why would we care to learn about another individual's cultures, right? So I think it's really being self-aware, maybe where our biases lie. Maybe if we find ourselves stereotyping certain groups, avoiding certain places, having negative talk with those around us, maybe we're hearing forms of discrimination. Some of this stuff can happen without us even realizing it. I always say to people, I talk about this stuff for a living, right? Like I talk about bias, I talk about assumptions, I talk about hate, so for me, I'm always thinking about it. So I'm more aware than probably those of you that don't work in this area, right? Similar to, I teach personal safety and self-defense on the side as well. So I'm always talking about, boundaries, which took me a long time to kind of really be better at, but boundaries and being aware and things to look for. And, if I didn't talk about it every day, maybe I wouldn't be paying attention to certain things, right? But it's really, really being self-aware. Like, how aware are we of our actions, right? Of the way we're speaking, So I think it's just something to consider. Questions, comments? The comment, the chat box isn't too chatty. Anyone have any questions or comments? You're too easy. Okay, we'll keep going then. Where does hate come from? We talked about diversity. We talked about what makes us diverse. Do we celebrate diversity or not? Why folks maybe are a little bit, resistant to diversity, or they don't necessarily celebrate diversity. But what about hate? Because I want to get into the area of hate-motivated crime. We will get a little legal for a minute. But, when you're thinking about hate, the type of hate where, okay, it goes beyond not liking someone that's different than us, right? Because you're allowed to do that. That's your choice, right? But this goes beyond that. Now I'm actually causing harm to somebody, from an identifiable group or someone that's different than me, or I'm doing something to their property, or I'm doing something to their place of worship. Where does that type of hate come from? Oh, if I saw you, I would handpick someone. I can't just pick on Ivana and Terry since they're the only two that actually, well, Ed, he piped in too. But anyone want to try? Where do you think hate comes from? Give it a minute or two. Well, I'm not going to give it a minute or two. I'll give it not even a minute. Give it a few seconds. Anyone want to try? Where does hate come from? I'm a slow typer, so sometimes I like to give this a little bit of time. People's ignorance. Thank you. Thank you. A learned behavior. People's ignorance. We learn it. Absolutely. I'll always say to my audience, none of us were born hating anyone, right? We certainly weren't born hating any groups of people, anyone. We weren't born hating anything, right? Misconceptions, absolutely. And that comes from that, that learned or, things that are just unlearned, right? We talk about the way we were raised, The internet, right? Imagine if, what always scares me, I'm a mother, and it doesn't scare me. I love being a mother. But what scares me is that there's a lot of children that don't really have safe places to go for information, right? Like maybe they can't talk to their family openly about diversity or groups that are different than them. Maybe they don't have a friend circle that they feel safe having these conversations around. So then what if all of a sudden, okay, well, I'm going to go to Google, right? Google will be able to tell me everything, right? Well, wow. Imagine the misconceptions and the misinformation, right? That are not just young people. I think we see this happening with a lot of folks, right? Imagine the misinformation and the misconceptions, right, that are out there if we just turn to the media, or we only ask a certain group of people that are all of the same mindset and the same, belief system, right? Well, if we're only going to those places for information, wow, right? So in terms of hate, it's a learned behavior. I also believe it can be an unlearned behavior. And I think that's another, big reason that, I feel so strongly about this program and why, to make a decision to go to my own, to do a program like this, it's scary, but I do know with my whole entire heart that there isn't any other program providing education like this. And I think our society needs it, For those of you that love presenting and love facilitating, I'm probably going to need some more facilitators at some point. So if you're ever interested, I'll show you my website a little later. Feel free to reach out, because capacity is always an issue, right? You have to find folks that are really, engaging and passionate, and see the value and the importance of this topic, right? But we have media, family, friends, past experiences, a lot of people, if they have a negative experience, maybe they had a horrible breakup, an unhealthy relationship, marriage, partnership, whatever. Maybe something happened to someone that we love, our family members, our children, and maybe, it was of a particular group that did something to someone that we love. That can be really, really tough. We can have that feeling of anger and we want to seek revenge, or we want to do something because now we're full of this hate, and I think that's, very, very important to be aware of, right? Past experiences can influence so much of our, our behavior, so many of our behaviors, our thought processes, right? Friends, well, that's obvious, right? I think for a lot of us, doesn't matter what our age demographic is, I think we're constantly reevaluating our friendships and our relationships, and that's okay. I think it's important to do so. Media, I talked about that. I struggle with that. I think I don't have a whole lot of time, to search for things on the media, but I certainly have a lot of close friends who, we talked in my last presentation on Saturday about confirmation bias, right? Like if we're only seeking out information to confirm our beliefs, then that's only going to continue to give us the information in that one, that one direction or that one area. We're not going to be challenged in ways, or maybe, find other information that might maybe contradict some of the learnings, right? And I think that's okay. I think it's important to have, to seek information from multiple people, areas. Websites can be dangerous. And lack of education. We talked about that, right? I think there's a lot of lack of exposure, lack of education in this area. Absolutely. So I do believe that that's certainly places where hate comes from. So thank you for those who added some comments to the chat. As you'll see, there's a definition here on the screen of what a hate crime, how a hate crime is defined in the criminal code. For those of you, I know we have some folks from Edmonton. I'm here in Calgary. Is anybody kind of watching or, calling in from any other areas? Is anyone other than Edmonton, Calgary, anywhere else? Oh, Regina. See, I don't know. And yeah, fill me in, Terry, because I haven't been way back when I presented at a school in Macklin, Saskatchewan, but I haven't spent a whole lot of time in your neck of the woods. Have you noticed or read in the media or anything on the news? Have there been recent or, during COVID, are you aware of any hate motivated crimes that have happened in your area? And anyone else too. I'm not sure where everyone else is calling in from, but anything that what's your level of awareness, on hate crimes? Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And Terry, you're welcome to stay on after the presentation. I'm not sure what you do for work, but I know if there's any way that I can support any of your communities in Regina with the work that I do, the schools, anything, I would love to come out and try to support your community or share some of the resources that I have. Yeah, racism seems to be alive and well in all areas, right? As I mentioned earlier, I'm originally from Halifax, Nova Scotia, and the history of racism goes deep back home. And I have to admit, I didn't work in the area of diversity and inclusion back then. I worked frontline, corrections. So it wasn't until I moved out west that I got into the area of diversity, equity and inclusion, and the area of hate bias. I've learned so much. And to be quite honest, I don't know everything, right? I'm not I guess I could be considered to be somewhat of a subject matter expert on hate motivated crime and incidents, only because I've worked in this area for so long. But there's so much I'm learning about, and policies change, new groups get added to. We'll talk later about I think you'll see up here, any criminal offense committed towards a person or property that is motivated by hatred towards the real or perceived group that the person belongs to. So I think during COVID, it's my understanding, I'm no longer with law enforcement, but I spoke to one of my previous colleagues, and I believe that healthcare workers have been added to that group. I'll often get questions, well, are teachers an identifiable group, or are police officers an identifiable group? So, there's always things changing and always things to learn, but yeah, it's certainly an area where I don't see it going away. I just think people are becoming more informed. I would hope that our legal system, Crown prosecutors, judges, police officers, investigators, I would hope that there's always that education and awareness that's staying current, because I think it's really important that everyone's on the same page so we can get some successful convictions for those that have been found, guilty of hate motivated crimes. So we'll talk about that a little later. So, you see there's a little picture up there. What is a hate crime, right? I try to make it as easy as possible. I've worked in this area for so long, and sometimes I get confused. So, it's basically any crime. So you have a crime, and if it's motivated on hatred towards that person's identifiable group, then now we have a hate crime. Okay. And later on, I'll show you, for those of you that aren't familiar, what happens, when it gets to if people are being convicted, or when it comes to sentencing, I'll show you kind of what happens. There's some graffiti there. I think when we had the large influx of newcomers and refugees arriving here in Canada, we saw an increase in graffiti, right? LRT stations, people's homes, people's vehicles were certainly being targeted. And there was vandalism and graffiti towards, people's property, which would be considered a hate crime. Now, I have a slide up here, which I think is, I'm not a police officer. I try to do whatever I can to prevent people from having to get involved in the criminal justice system. That's my stance on things. I think that hate incidents is probably one of my biggest areas that I really want to try to educate on, and really have not just our youth, I guess, participants in general, really see the significance of this and really, really understand the impact. I think there's a lot of people who just think, well, it's just a word. It's just a name. Big deal. Why are they so sensitive? Or why is this bothering them? It's just a word. It's just a name. And I don't think people realize the significant impact that words and names can have on folks. I don't think, there's a lot of people that don't really think about people's lives outside of school or outside of the workplace, or, and I always tell the students that I work with, sometimes school is the only positive place our young people have, right? Like sometimes school is somewhere that they just can't wait to get away from their home. Maybe their lives at home, they don't have the privilege of living in a home that's full of love and, fosters healthy relationships and healthy conversations. There's some young people that can't wait to get out of their damn home and just go to school. And if they show up at school and now all of a sudden they're being excluded from groups, being called names, having slurs, said, to them and things like this, then what do you think that does to a student? What do you think that does to a person? When you think about mental health, it's huge. And so for me, I really, really try to focus a lot on the hate incidents. I think the hate incidents, in my opinion, I believe that if we can start reducing and or eliminating the amount of hate incidents, then ultimately we can reduce and or eliminate hate crime, right? A lot of it starts with the names, with the words, with the, these actions that don't meet the threshold of a criminal offense, but it's teetering that line just enough. It's like poke, 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 poke until finally somebody snaps. People can think about even like microaggressions when we're thinking of, it's separate from hate incidents. But I think what we've heard from a lot of folks that experience microaggressions, it's like getting, hundreds of paper cuts in a day, or mosquito bites. It's just constant. Whereas some people might just get bit by a mosquito once, or maybe you'll just get one paper cut. But some folks will say that this is how they feel. They feel like it's like a daily reoccurring, a thing that they're hearing, and that it has a huge impact. So, these hate incidents, these are things like I often will say that it's really important to challenge these things. I'm sure a couple of you can put this in the chat, but things that I've challenged a lot of my friends with. I still have some friends, adult friends, mind you, which, this is embarrassing almost. We see a little bit of a decrease, I feel like, in schools, but adults for some reason want to hold on to the word retarded. When they make comments like, oh, that's retarded. Could that be offensive to somebody? I mean, I know some of you are watching. I say the easy answer is yes. I think some of the words that we use, and when I've spoken to some of my close friends about this word, usually it's, oh, I didn't even think about it that way. Or I never even realized, I don't know, it was just a word. Like I never really thought about it. And that's usually how it works with a lot of these words, right? A lot of people have never been challenged, right, on their language in a safe way. This doesn't mean you have to start a fight or lose a friendship or anything like that. But I think there's a lot of individuals that have never ever been challenged on some of the words that they use. And I think it's important to have some of these conversations. I always say to people, it's a matter of where your line in the sand is. The way I look at it is, if I'm hanging out with my friend and they're saying that word and they've said it, enough times to be like, okay, this is like word that they tend to use frequently. Well, if I don't say anything, if I don't have a conversation with them, then who's to say we're not going to be somewhere in public, somewhere in a setting, where there's a lot of people around us and they might use that word and it's going to be very, very uncomfortable. Or it could be offending somebody, somebody that's around us at that particular time. So if I can avoid something like that from happening, then why wouldn't I? Right? Even the word, we hear this quite commonly in schools where a lot of our, youth are like, oh, that's gay. Again, it's for a lot of our youth, they're not like trying to really like hurt someone per se, but they're just not thinking of the impact, right? They're not thinking of the impact of those around them. And so I think it's important to start just having conversations. There's so many racial slurs out there. Like that's certainly, I don't need to get into that. I think we all know what they are, but I think even the word with the R word and saying that things are, towards someone's sexual orientation, those are heavy enough, I think. And I think it's really important that we have these conversations, right? So I'm welcome, or I'm open. Like if any of you would like to add anything to this, or make a comment. But I'll bet you, for those of you watching, I'll bet you in this past week, or, in the very, very, not too long ago, that we might have heard somebody use a word that maybe just didn't made us uncomfortable, right? And later we can try to practice. If we have some time, we'll have time to practice on ways that we can respond to some of this stuff. So that's a really big piece of the DeleteHate program as well. It's, empowering people to respond to some of this stuff. And that doesn't necessarily mean we have to respond to everything all the time, because as I mentioned earlier, safety is number one, but I certainly think, what we're seeing is that we're seeing a lot of silent witnesses, or people that want to disassociate, with something, or just, mind their business, or not get involved, or not have a conversation. And I think, if more of us spoke up and we had conversations, I think that, we would maybe hear less of these comments. I always say in schools, there's more people in the schools that want to come to school every single day, have a positive experience, not have to witness any of this stuff. People just really, the majority of our students want to go to school every day and just feel safe. And they don't really want to deal with drama, and I always say there's strength in numbers, I think it's important that we all come together and we start saying that, no, we're not going to tolerate these words. There's so many other words in our vocabulary that we can use, and never mind the fact that at some point it just really makes us sound ridiculous. If we're out there using some of these words, it makes us sound not only disrespectful and ignorant, but it makes us sound silly. So it's having these conversations, I think, is so important. Even jokes, anyone that's on this, this conversation that knows me knows that I love to have fun. I love to laugh. I'm loud. I love to have a good time. Like, it's kind of who I am, but I don't do it at the expense of somebody. I don't do it at the expense of hurting somebody or offending somebody. Certainly not on purpose. If I was to ever offend someone, I'd be very, very quick to own it, apologize and learn from it. Right. Because again, it goes back to that intent versus impact, right? Which is an area that I spoke about at my last presentation. I spent, a little bit of time on separating the intent from the impact, right? We need to start focusing more on that impact. And a lot of that is with the words that we're using. So, I have a comment. Oh yeah. When we talk about, like, oh my gosh, again, I was at a high school today, so we talked even about, so if someone's from a particular culture, so if someone's from an Indigenous group, or like I put myself out there, I'm covered in tattoos, for example. So there's been times where I know people have judged me based on how I look and maybe made assumptions that I might be a certain way, act a certain way. And so I know how that feels. But I certainly have heard from a lot of folks say, people from the Indigenous community, teenagers, right? People from different racial backgrounds, right? Please feel free to keep putting stuff in the chat, because this is stuff that we're seeing, right? So, one of the youth one time said to me at one of the schools, he had, he had a bit of an attitude, and he's like, what, if they think I'm going to do it, I do it. Like, if they think I'm going to do something negative, I do it. And I'm like, oh man, like, that's not helping, right? That's just helping to perpetuate the stereotypes that people have, the negative ones. The best thing to do is to prove these people wrong. Let them follow you. If they want to follow you, what are we going to do about it, right? All we can do is continue to prove these people wrong, and encourage these groups to have training for their staff around bias and assumptions and hate. And again, that goes back, right? There's that lack of training and awareness. There's a lot of people that take on positions of power and have, positions of authority that they just don't have the training and they don't have the education. And I think there's a lot of danger in that, so yeah, Terry, I appreciate that, because there's a lot of those stereotypes and there's a lot of that bias that's alive and well. Absolutely. Yeah. Okay. So that's, the hate incidents. That we can come back to any of this. Like, I know we have a lot of time, and it's, no one's talking lots, so we may finish early, but Let's see. I have a couple of case studies that I'd like to share, with the group. And I'm sure, depending upon where you are in Regina, Edmonton, Calgary, wherever we are, there could be, different situations that we could share. I tried to, these are fairly recent examples of some hate crimes that we've seen in our community. Case study number one, during COVID, right? During COVID, we saw a rise in hate towards the Asian community. A lot of blame, right? Which, we saw all kinds of crazy stuff during COVID, right? But yeah, what we truly saw was an influx in hatred towards the Asian community, right? So, the lady down the bottom has a sign, "Hate is a virus." Yeah, that's pretty powerful. And I would have to agree. A lot of graffiti, vandalism, propaganda, so this was kind of during the summer of 2020. There was a situation where 3 offenders were caught on camera in the early morning, right? Vandalizing. There were some places here in Calgary and at Calgary Chinatown, that were targeted. We've seen recently the Jewish community, right? With things that are happening. And the Jewish community they've been victimized long before, what's happening currently in our world. But I know we've had, so many, incidents and crimes. We had the Holocaust Memorial vandalized. We just had that happen again, I believe. We've had people's homes, mailboxes. We had this is when I first started in the area of hate crime and hate incidents. There's a large rock retaining wall on a very busy street in Calgary, 14th Street. And years ago, someone had taken spray paint and spray painted, 6 million more. And, for those watching, I'm sure you can, you have an idea what that's referencing. And, you think about the impact, right, that this has on the community. And not only the Jewish community, like I'm not Jewish, but when I see things like this happen, even in the Chinese community, in any community, this type of hate scares me, right? Because I'll often ask myself, and I'll ask those that I present to, if someone can hate a group of people that much without even knowing them all, what makes me think they're not going to target my group next, right? Maybe they're going to have a negative experience or see something on TV, and now they're going to target my group or my best friend's group or my partner's group or my son's group, whatever, right? So it's one of these things where it doesn't just, like, for me, when I see a hate crime happen, I don't just think, oh, poor them. I think poor us as a society. We all have a role to play in eliminating this stuff and standing up and not tolerating this type of behavior in our community. So it's not just a them problem, in my opinion. It's an us problem, right? So that was kind of what we saw during COVID. I'm sure a lot of you can share, stories. We talked, Terry, you had mentioned, folks from the Indigenous community. That's another group that have been victimized by hate incidents and hate crimes for so long, often my friends from the Indigenous community will say, they're so used to it. Like sometimes they're so used to the names, they're so used to these words that it's almost just like daily, like we talked earlier about microaggressions, like slaps. And you get so used to it. You don't even want to talk. You don't even bother reporting it, which bothers me because, going back to the hate incidents, these hate incidents need to be reported. Years ago when I started with the Calgary Police Service, the police service, they weren't capturing hate incidents. They were only capturing hate crimes. And I remember being a part of that conversation saying, no. Like, we have to have some sort of reporting system designed to capture these hate incidents. And for those of you, I know you've probably met some folks and some of you are part of the Alberta Hate Crimes Committee, but, Stop Hate AB. I promote Stop Hate AB on all my marketing material because it's an online platform where, some folks, if they don't feel comfortable going to law enforcement, calling the non-emergency line or calling the police, period, that at least it's another place that they can go to at least have this stuff documented, because what that does is we're able to monitor, or the folks that, monitor the Stop Hate AB website, and that what our document is, we're able to monitor what's happening here in our province. And if we see all of a sudden, oh my goodness, Brooks, for example, like maybe they're reporting a whole bunch of hate incidents. Well, okay, let's reach out to Brooks to see if we can provide some education, some resources, host some focus groups, some sharing circles, something, so we can try to support the community to come together to figure out what the heck's going on, right? But there's a huge lack of reporting, and I think I have a slide on that, but we'll talk a bit about the reporting, the lack thereof. I'm not sure if there's any law enforcement on here today, but you're welcome to speak to that. Another case study here. I mean, they all make me sick. This has happened, something like this has happened multiple times actually, where we've had the vulnerable population targeted, right? Folks that are homeless, targeted simply for being homeless, right? A member from the vulnerable community. And here's some individuals who, were caught on camera assaulting a homeless man, And again, like I go back to these crimes, and what I always try to really put emphasis on is that I would never feel passionate talking about every single crime in the world. I mean, it's impossible. I couldn't. There's too many crimes. But when it comes to hate crimes, it's something that I feel so strongly towards, because these are crimes happening to people simply because of who they are, right? Their identity. They didn't do anything. It's not even about revenge. It's this, they're getting attacked, or they're being harassed or being harmed, or their homes are being vandalized, their vehicles, their places of worship, simply because of who they are. And that doesn't sit well with me. That's sickening to me, that any group should feel unsafe, should feel in a certain way just because, they need to hide a part of their identity, or they need to feel unsafe because they're from a particular group. That's not okay. So you have members from the homeless community being targeted. It's just awful, awful. Another one, there was a lady who, she was going to the Dollarama, like, for goodness sake, going to the Dollarama. And there was an individual, and, she was spat on, called a racial slur for no reason, simply because of the color of her skin. This is stuff that you think you read in history books, or, a lot of people say, well, that doesn't happen anymore. Yes, it does, unfortunately. And the education, the awareness, the conversations need to continue. And, and this is why I think it's so important to share, the DeleteHate program, because we do need to have some more education around this, right? When you think of thanks, Terry. When you think of the effects on the individual, the effects on the community, right? You think about that. You think about what that does, during COVID with the Asian community. How safe did they feel? How safe did they feel letting their children out to play, letting their kids walk to school, get the bus, like go places? How'd they feel going through university campus? Like, how do you think people felt? Similar to, every single community that's victimized with this, with these types of things, right? The Jewish community, all the folks from the Muslim community, every community, the Indigenous community, the members from the LGBT community. You think about what impact this type of hatred has. This has a ripple effect, and it instills fear among so many, and it shouldn't be that way. We're supposed to take pride in being Canadian and living in a country where we have the freedoms, right? We have our freedom of expression, freedom of speech. We have all the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, thank goodness, but we're supposed to be living in a country where we celebrate our differences, right? And we don't see that happening all the time. And I think we really need to spend some time having these conversations, because it truly has such detrimental effects on not only the individual, but the whole entire community, right? When you think about individuals, people who, their crisis of identity. Sometimes there's people who will hide, parts of their culture. They're almost afraid to say, like, oh, I'm from this particular background, or I'm from, and that's really unfortunate. I think we need to be, or we all should be proud of our cultural heritage and our cultural identity. we shouldn't have to feel like we need to hide something, in fear of our safety, or in fear, maybe we'll be judged, maybe we won't get that job interview, or we won't, get the job period, or even the interview, by maybe, talking about our cultural background, or even things simple as our last name. We can go on forever about that. Loss of health, huge mental health, implications, right? Fear of repeat attack. This is a big reason why, or I guess one of the reasons why folks don't report these crimes. Often what we'll hear from the victims is that they're afraid it's going to happen again. Or if I report it, it's going to be worse, or they're going to do something to my family. So rather than report it, they'll keep it inside. They won't talk to people about it, right? That fear and distrust of the offending group, I can certainly see that. Anger and desire for revenge, retaliation. There's some folks that are like, you know what, I'm not going to call the police. I'm going to deal with it on my own. And there's certainly times where we've seen that happen, right? Where people want to take things in their own hands. So we've certainly seen that. And then when it comes to the community, oh my gosh, the whole entire community is affected. Like I said, and not just members from, the community that was targeted. Like I said to you earlier, for me, when I see any of this, it literally, like, I have conversations with my circle of friends, with my children, it's scary. It truly is scary that some of the stuff that we see happening, the violence, the crimes, sense of vulnerability, a lot of community fear and tension, as you can imagine, right? Community polarization, us versus them, I don't like to draw everything back to COVID, but I think, we certainly saw that during COVID as well, right? That divisiveness, right? That divisiveness, that us versus them. And certainly increased security concerns. I think law enforcement, they can only do so much. I would just say, for me, I guess my only hope for law enforcement would be proper training, proper education, and the proper people in the positions to be dealing with the community and dealing with crimes like this and or incidents. So that's the only hope and desire I would have for law enforcement, right? So open to questions, comments, please. Welcome to that. For those of you that love the internet, there's lots of us. I actually don't like the internet that much. I'm okay on social media, but not great. But I think even with hate in the internet, it is certainly one of the fastest growing sections on the internet. I'd have to speak to my colleagues who are still, some of my past colleagues who are still with law enforcement to kind of get current information on hate in the internet. But I do know that there have been successful convictions here in Canada that have resulted in jail time and internet bans. Years ago, there were some individuals in Calgary, and they were recruiting on playgrounds. They were recruiting back then through their music, and they were going out to different playgrounds, schoolyards, and trying to recruit children to join their hate group, So definitely active recruiting on social media. That's, it was crazy. And the individuals back then, there was a huge raid to this particular group way back when, and they were able to seize like hundreds of these, this is going to date this, but CDs back then, right? They were able to seize a whole bunch of them, and they were able to get there and shut the website down and hold that person criminally responsible. And, because sometimes we don't have time to get into like hate speech and freedom of speech. That is a whole presentation on its own. There's a lot to unpack in that one, but I think what we're seeing is that there are people who can be very, very crafty. And what they do is they have a website where they say, this is freedom of speech. I'm allowed. This is like my website. I'm allowed to do and say what I'm able to do or say. But I think what we see is people cross that line, right? Where they're trying to promote, like the incitement of hatred, or, promote causing harm, right, to somebody or a group of people. And that's when, that's not freedom of speech anymore, right? So I think there's that fine line, right? And as you'll see there, the police do regularly monitor sites and social media platforms. I always encourage my audience to, if you see something that looks funky, report it. You can report it to Stop Hate AB. You could report it to the non-emergency line at CPS. If there's students, they can just report it to their teacher, let them deal with it. I think it's important that we do have these conversations. And in a big piece of my presentation, why it's called Delete Hate, I always tell people, like, if I see something nasty come through my Instagram or whatever, I'm not being like, oh my God, this is so gross, I better share it now with 20 of my friends, say, look how gross this is. I delete it. And then maybe I'll have a conversation with somebody. It's like, oh my God, I can't believe what I saw. Like, this was disgusting. But I'm really encouraging people to delete stuff. Don't keep sending this stuff out, because the more we keep sending these messages out, and the more we keep distributing this stuff, the more pain and harm it's causing people. I often say, if you see something in your community, vandalism, hate, graffiti, report it right away, because it needs to be gone. Like, we need to get rid of it. Symbols of hate, hateful words, like, that needs to be gone. I don't even care if someone spray paints over it. Like, I know that might be graffiti as well, but hey, like, I'd rather it be gone in some way than people driving by and children walking by and people going by and having to see that stuff. We need to start getting rid of it, deleting it. So that's a big, another reason why I named this presentation Delete Hate, because we got to start deleting it. And whether, online platforms, our vocabulary, we need to start getting rid of some of this, all of it, when it comes to hate. The criminal code, I popped up there quick for those of you that love sections in the criminal code. With the students, I usually give them, a couple little examples of what's a hate crime. And I try to trick them and, give them different crimes that are certainly crimes, but not hate crimes. So, I always say, if something is personal, and if someone is seeking revenge, let's say because they stole their boyfriend or their girlfriend or their partner, and let's say they hate them and they beat them up, the students love that example. We talk about that's still a crime, right? But even though we hated that person or, the group of people, we didn't hate them because of their identifiable group they belong to. We hated them for something personal. That's different. That's a different kind of hate. A crime's a crime. If someone assaults somebody, then people would still get charged with assault. But how it works under the Canadian Criminal Code is that when it comes to sentencing, the section 718.2 would be applied to the crime. So it would be an additional section added at sentencing. And that individual or that group could be looking at enhanced sentencing if the motivating factor can be articulated and proved in court. So, if they can prove that there was a hate motivation to any crime, then the section 718.2 would be added at sentencing. And that's how it works here in Canada. So this is why I always say to people, like, report it, even if it's a hate incident, because maybe there's somebody harassing somebody at an LRT platform, let's say, for example, and they're calling them racial slurs, they're threatening them, they're telling them to go back to their country or whatever. This needs to get reported, because if, people continue to report this, and all of a sudden, if a crime occurs and it's from that same person, well, then law enforcement, people all through the court system, they're going to have the information that they need to articulate and to show that this crime was motivated by hate. But if people just keep this in and they don't report it, then it's tough, right? Because it's really tough to prove motivation, right? So this is where it's really important to be documenting these types of things. As you'll read up here, mischief to religious property, advocating genocide. We spoke earlier about the public incitement of hatred and willful promotion of hatred. We see this, a lot of times at protests. There'll be people, holding certain signs that certainly they're freedom of speech, freedom of thought, expression. But when it gets to, like if you're making statements that are inciting harm, right, towards a group or, or an individual, then that's different. Okay. So please feel free to comment or ask questions. Okay. As you'll see there, we talked about this earlier. We have 10%, right? Ish. Again, this is something, I have a meeting next week with some of my past colleagues, and we talk about this with the Alberta Hate Crimes Committee as well. But still very, very underreported due to all kinds of reasons, right? That fear of repeat victimization, the privacy piece, fear of law enforcement, right? That's what's kind of nice about having my job now independently. I'm not tied to law enforcement. So for me, if I can work with people and try to, especially our young people, and educate and empower them and provide them with some tools and some skills to avoid having to have an altercation with the police or having to get involved with the criminal justice system. That's a huge priority for me. I also see a program like this fitting in restorative justice. I think there's a lot of room for the type of presentation like this to work within the restorative justice circles, because I think, if we can avoid our young people having to go through the court system, and sometimes, again, there's acts and there's behaviors from some that where they just didn't really think about the impact. They weren't educated. They just weren't thinking, right? They weren't thinking it through. So I do see room for a program like this in restorative justice. We have cultural and language barriers, right? I mean, sometimes people just don't know that if they call 911 or they call the non-emergency line or whoever, that they'll have interpreters or they'll be able to translate languages, right? When there's over like 150 languages being able to be translated. A lot of people just don't know. Right? And sometimes they feel like nothing's going to happen. And let's face it, we see this happening at our school system. Well, I told a teacher that never did anything about it. I told so that nothing happened, so I give up. And that's to feel defeated, especially when you try to go to law enforcement or a teacher or someone that are, they're supposed to be there to help us. And if we feel that, they didn't listen to us or they didn't take our report seriously, then what are the chances we're going to try to do it again, right? Now, my presentation on Saturday covered bias and assumptions, so I'm not going to spend time on this, but I certainly think it's important, and I'm going to put up a little graph here. I think it's important that we really just do a little bit of thinking in terms of, I always call it, assumptions, judging people, prejudging, bias, all those fun words that we're all very familiar with. But, are we, when I think about kind of this, I don't know if this will work, like this layer, the given, it's kind of like our given identity, right? Well, people just think by looking at us. And there's such little information that people truly have, right? Just by looking at us. But yet so many people act like they know us, they make assumptions. A lot of times they won't even engage in conversation based on that given, I always call it, or that 10% of who we are. I've certainly experienced it in my life. And I'm sure a lot of you in this room could share examples of when you've experienced this, where people can come up with lots of information about you by basically 10% of who you are, and I just think it's important. And I always challenge my audience, walk past that 10%, you might surprise yourself. I look at my circle of friends, not like the people I just say hi to, not just like my acquaintances, like my circle of friends. I look how diverse they are, could be age, race, beliefs, all kinds of different things, right? There's a lot of people who they don't look like me, who are in my close group. And I like that, I like to surround myself with people that aren't necessarily like me. And when I say like me, that outer layer, right? So I want you to think about that. And I challenge every single one of you when you leave this workshop today to start looking past that 10% and just to say hello to people, just to be kind, regardless, right? I mean, I'm not going to not say hi to one person, but then if someone looks a little different, not say hi to them. I don't know if it's the East Coaster in me, but I say hi to everybody. Maybe I might even freak some people out sometime by saying hi to them, but I think it's important. For me, I'm going to acknowledge people. Obviously, number one is safety first. There's maybe some groups I'm not going to just jump right up and be like, hey, but I certainly think it's important, again, to show people the type of respect that I think everybody out there that they want. We all want to be treated with respect, right? So, but anyway, you choose to do what you want to do. But I really encourage people to walk past that 10%. Okay. Briefly, I know there's not a lot of chatty people in this group, so this portion of the workshop is not as exciting unless people want to talk to me. So, this is certainly, I'm certified in anti-discrimination, anti-racism response. A group of us were actually just recertified thanks to the support from the Alberta Hate Crimes Committee in ART training. And we deliver workshops all through the province. I actually incorporate this type of response training in all of my school presentations, because I think a lot of our young people, they just don't know how to respond to some of this stuff. So if their friends are making certain comments or they're hearing certain racial slurs, what we're seeing in the school system is teachers don't know how to address it and students don't know how to address it. So for me, what I'm doing is, I will provide training and workshops for any group that's interested. But with my DeleteHate program, this is certainly incorporated in my messaging and in the curriculum, because I think it's really important that everyone is able to discuss this and practice some scenarios. So again, it's tough to really go over scenarios with a group that's not super chatty in the chat box, or I don't see anybody. But these comments, I'll just give you one example, and we'll see how it goes. But in terms of scenarios, I remember when I first moved to Calgary from Nova Scotia, I never had background in anti-discrimination response. I worked corrections, I worked frontline. I certainly knew how to respond to things, but it probably wasn't the right way. So over the years, I've obviously been trained on multiple occasions now in this area of anti-discrimination response. So I'm a lot more confident now, but I wasn't when I first moved here. And I'll never forget the time when I first moved to Calgary. I was at a store, and Calgary was it was like mind-blowing to me. Like I said, the amount of diversity, how big it was. Like there were so many things that were mind-blowing for me when I moved here. But I remember being at a shopping, at a store, at a convenience store. And I was with my child at the time, who was a lot younger back then. And I remember standing in line, and there was a man. He wasn't a very nice man. There was a man in front of me, and he was in a bit of a mood. He was in a lot of a mood. He was not a very nice man. The lady behind the counter, her English was a little weak. Nothing like I could understand her. But this man, I think he came into this store not wanting to understand her, right? Like, I don't think it was a her problem. It was absolutely a him problem. So at the end of his order, he had basically asked, wow, how much does it cost? And so she tells him how much his order was. And he couldn't understand her. Again, I still think this to this day. I don't think he wanted to understand her. I understood her. Fine. Okay. So anyway, he basically barks back in her face. He's like, what did you say? And she repeated herself. And so now you can tell, like, the energy in the line, super uncomfortable. I'm like, cannot believe this man's being like this. Then he turns around to all of us in line and he says, before they let these people move into our country, the least they can do is learn how to speak English. Now, I see more people joining and watching. So that was the comment. I want to ask any of you that are willing to provide a response, give it a whirl. I didn't have this cheat sheet back then, okay? I didn't know how to respond to it the right way. I knew how to respond to it the wrong way. Does anyone want to try a response? What could you do? What would you do? What could you say? What could you do? The right way. I knew how to deal with it the wrong way. Sometimes I wish there was like a little thing where you could see if people are typing, because then I'd know. But anyway, I didn't know what to say. And I'll be honest with all of you in today's session. I know we're getting near, the end. Dude, I hear you. I usually make a joke when I'm presenting this, especially to the students. I'm like, you know what I did? And they're like, what? And I'm like, I slapped him. And I'm totally joking, because I would not do that, right? I want to do it, but I wouldn't do it, right? Because obviously I had my child with me and I didn't want to scare this poor woman any more than she was already afraid. Like, that's what I tell people, like, by responding the wrong way, by like being violent or starting to swear and yell at this man. Thanks, Patricia. By, yelling and swearing at this man or whatever, I'm only going to cause more of a scene. And this poor woman, the victim, is just going to be like, holy smokes, these people are crazy. Like I'm afraid to work here. I don't even want to come back to work. So there's so many things with that. But no, Tina, this is usually where people are like, I only know the wrong ways. I know what I want to say, how I want to say it. But then what are the implications of that, right? So I appreciate your honesty. This stuff takes work. Like there's hundreds of these responses. And like I said, I've taken this training now twice. I'm open when I give you my information here next. Please feel free, come on my website, check out my website, email me, call me. I can support any of you. That's why I'm here. But yeah, I like this one. You could mention that often newcomers don't have a chance to learn English as they have to support themselves financially first, right? Yeah. You know what? And the thing is, I wanted to say something to that man. I wanted to tell him how much it cost because I understood her. But then I kept going through my mind thinking like, this is not a her problem. It's a him problem. I don't want to speak for her. I don't want to now make her feel less than. He's already done a good job at that. But to be quite honest, in light of time, what I did, Tina, since I didn't know what to do, I did nothing. I stayed silent, which is what we see quite often. People don't know what to do. They're silent. They're uncomfortable. And I remember walking out of the store that day feeling like garbage. I remember, thinking to myself, what did I just teach my daughter? Like this man was an absolute jerk and he was so offensive. He was just so offensive and ignorant. And I didn't do a thing because I didn't know what to do, right? I knew how to slap him, punch him, yell at him, swear at him, tell him this, tell him that. But number one, when it comes to anti-racism, anti-discrimination response, number one is your safety, okay? I never ever want anyone to take anything from this presentation and now all of a sudden feel the need to go, comment or respond to every single person that we're dealing with. Because let's face it, there's some people that A, aren't going to receive it well, B, are unsafe. And sometimes it's just not worth saying anything to them at all. The thing that we're forgetting is we always, when we're angry, thanks, Kevin, because, right, that's how a lot of people respond. But what happens is when we get angry, when this stuff hits us, because we all obviously here in this conference, we're taking part in this work because we care about our world, right? But a lot of times what we do is we forget about the victim. We're so caught up in I want to do this and I want to do that and I want to do this and da, da, da. We forget about the victim. So if I was to rewind this scenario, and believe me, unfortunately, I've been in situations similar to this since, this incident, and since I've been trained, I support the victim. I gauge my safety. If it's a young person or if it's someone I don't feel unsafe around, I might support the victim right in front of them and say, oh my gosh, I am so sorry they said that. You know what? Like that was rude, uncalled for. I'm really sorry they made you feel that way. If I feel unsafe, I'm going to wait until they leave. I'm going to say, whew, I am so sorry they said that. I'm really sorry they made you feel that way. And sometimes, I think all of us, right? I think there's been times where we might see something, maybe someone has said something to us and we just wish someone would have said, you know what, that friggin' sucks. I'm really sorry you had to, I'm sorry they treated you like that. Use whatever words you want, by the way. I'm just trying to be really professional and keep it as G-rated as possible today, but you can say whatever you want to say. But supporting the victim, I think, goes a long way, longer than we realize, But once again, this is stuff, that really, really, really takes time and it takes practice. One thing I like to do, I'll use humor sometimes when it comes to stereotyping and bias, questioning the validity. It's kind of fun. If I hear a stereotype, for example, and all women are bad drivers. Okay. Once snow comes, I'm going in that category. Okay. I'm the worst driver in the winter, but anyway, I'm owning it, but doesn't mean that every other woman. I have some of my girlfriends, they're amazing drivers in the winter. They're so brave, but I use this one. If someone said that to me, if I heard someone use a stereotype or make a statement like that, sometimes I play dumb. It's fun. It's safe. So I'll pretend it's the first time I ever heard it my whole entire life. I'm like, what? All of them? Every single one? All of them. All of them can't drive all the time. For real? And sometimes people will look at me like I'm crazy, which I'm okay with. But I'm making my point. I'm forcing that person to rethink what they've said. Because sometimes, and we all know these people, sometimes people just talk and they don't even think. They just, right? They just talk. They're not thinking about the impact, and sometimes we just have to remind people and give them some time to process what they've said. This stuff it's not bulletproof, right? Sometimes they'll say the exact same thing back to you and you're like, oh no, I got to try something else. But this is why this stuff takes practice, okay? This is just something that if any of you would like some support, in this area, reach out. There's a number of us who deliver these workshops on behalf of, with the Alberta Hate Crimes Committee. As I mentioned, I am going to be inserting this type of work in every single presentation I deliver because I think it's important, and sometimes, you know what, I have up here, call it discrimination, call it racism, call it out. Sometimes you have to, that sounds like racism. That sounds like bias. That sounds like, homophobia. Sometimes we just got to call it out, but again, certainly important to gauge, right, your safety first. Pointing out the hurtful nature, I think that's a really good one as well. That's or just talking about how it makes you feel uncomfortable, right? So cool. Yeah, I'm very familiar with Social Stride. I would love to work more with you folks. So yeah, lots of stuff. And I know the Social Stride does a lot of stuff around like active bystander and active witness training. So it's certainly an area that I've worked in for a long time. So reach out, Edward. I would love to do some work with you in the future. For my wonderful friends, now at the end of my presentation, I have 12 viewers. Oh my gosh. I hope those of you in this room enjoyed today's workshop. I hope the whole conference has been going just so well. I will stick around for questions. As you will see here, just under my name, that's my website. On my website's my phone number. I'm at schools. They're really starting to fill up. So that's my hope. I hope that every single school year, every single month, every single day, we can get filled up delivering these presentations. So if there's schools, community groups, community organizations, please reach out to me. And if there's any way that I can support your groups, let me. So reach out. Yeah. Yeah. Thanks, Chelsea. So I'll stick around for those of you that have some questions or comments. I love it. And if not, have the best rest of your day, rest of your week. Yeah, Chelsea, it's hard, right? Wording is tough, and I am not perfect. I have certainly, made mistakes and learned from them, right? But it's tough work. It's tough work, but important. All right. Well, everyone, it's been a pleasure. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, being a bystander is tough. And depending upon where we are, another big area that I want to take this work in is the area of sports. I'm working on it. There's a few contacts. There's a few people I want to reach out to, but I think in sports, right? I love sports. I played sports. My son plays sports. But I think, we often will hear things and see things in the stands, or if we're watching, at a tournament, people heckling the poor referees and oh my gosh, the players, like, whew, it's definitely a lot of room for this work in sports. So that's definitely an area for those of you, if you play sports or have children in sports, reach out.